now we come to prophecy number 10, dated for the year 1708, where the beast institutes greetings of Mary and gift-giving, to celebrate the defeat of the witnesses. Which is an obvious, and historically unique, reference to Christmas. The year 1708 was one of the most important years in Western civilization, in reference to the counter-reformation and its goal of the destruction of emerging biblical Christianity from the Reformation. 4 major things occurred simultaneously in 1708 that would fulfill the prophecy in Revelation chapter 11, verse 10. In the year 1708, 4 major events took place in the history of religion that changed the course of civilization. These 4 events and developments were the seminal moments in prophetic history that fulfilled the prophecy given by John in Revelation chapter 11 verse 10, written over 1.5 millennia earlier. These 4 developments are as follows, not in order of their occurrence, but in order of their importance. The first was the completion of the rebuilding of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. This was the same cathedral destroyed in the fire of London in 1666, which you saw in video 27 on the burning of the 2 witnesses and God's retribution. Secondly, also during the same year, a very important literary work was completed, entitled Collier's Ecclesiastical History, and it was published also in 1708. The third development was the emergence of something called Tractarianism, which that would eventually be called the Oxford Movement in English society and religion. This was reflected in the thesis of Collier's Ecclesiastical History, which we will discuss in a few minutes. And the fourth thing that happened in 1708 was the consolidation of the East India Trading Company, one of the most powerful and corrupt commercial corporations to ever exist in history. The Oxford Movement made it one of their primary goals to restore the observance of Christmas among the common people. And one of the things they instituted in order to achieve this was the giving of gifts, as you see right there in this article. But if this were not all amazing enough on its own, if you research the first recorded historically documented use of the intentional greeting of Mary, as in Merry Christmas, you will discover it was recorded in a letter by a British merchant marine captain sailing for the East India Company. And the date of this letter, which documents the earliest recorded use of the greeting, occurs in the year 1710, which is literally only 2 years after the target date of the prophecy of 1708, and all the counter-reformation events which occurred in that very year. So we see that the prophecy was not only fulfilled, but in the very time frame in history that it had predicted, and even by the very people who fulfilled it in history. The prophecy of Revelation chapter 11 verse 10 has in fact come to pass. And Christmas is the very custom it is pointing its finger at, prophetically, as a custom instituted by the beast. These customs are part of what the book of Revelation is calling the worship of the image of the beast. Both Jupiter and the Sun have moved into Gemini, and Gemini is rising on the eastern horizon at sunrise, in the horizontal position, as though the 2 witnesses were laying on the ground, as though they were dead. But, as it rises through the sky that day, Gemini moves to the vertical position as though they are standing up. And then, Gemini sets on the western horizon with the sunset, standing upright on the ground. And this all occurs on precisely July 8, 1741, at the very exact time in history the First and Second Great Awakenings are beginning. What are the odds of that? There is obviously no way this all could have been a random accident. And what was so remarkable about Jonathan Edwards' sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God? It was subtitled, The Dangers of an Unconverted Clergy. And what it produced in its hearers was described as people being so moved by great fear that they literally physically shaked and cried and moaned. It was great fear. Some of the greatest fear ever recorded in the history of evangelism sermons. It produced great fear on the hearers who had been seduced by the counter-reformation out of Europe. It literally put the fear of God into the public. But that was not the only fear it produced. As the Great Awakening took effect in America, it laid the groundwork historically for what would come years later as the American Revolution. The 2 witnesses were standing up again. In England, and its counter-reformation Catholicized state church was in great fear of what they saw coming. So we discover that the 7 voices in chapter 10 were the Lollards because they had 7 founders, and the word Lollard meant to mumble with the voice. We discovered the two witnesses were the Protestant Reformation, because they were called by two names only, and the term Protestant originally meant to bear witness. And now we see that the revival of the two witnesses was literally the awakening and revival of Protestantism, which had died out because of the counter-reformation, Oxford movement. And all these historic events were accompanied with both signs in the heavens, and verifiable documented events on the earth. But this information also points to the very unwanted truth, that the counter-reformation is indeed working for the Antichrist, and that Christmas is in fact the worship of the image of the beast, in Revelation, which you will continue to see more and more proof of, as we continue to go through the book. The world during a 7-year tribulation period, as is constantly claimed. It is a panoramic collection of prophecies about history, from the author's perspective, past, present and future. Using astronomical dating in the sky, geological events in the earth, and historical events among nations, to unmistakably time-frame those prophecies, on the historical timeline. Counter-reformationists, who are responsible for the promotion of futurism's rapture eschatology, know that Revelation chapter 11 blows a huge irreparable black hole in their eschatological scheme of prophecy. But they do not actually care, because futurism's rapture eschatology was never developed and promoted because it was true. It was developed and promoted, precisely because it wasn't. It was a propaganda theology designed from its beginnings, to deceive and seduce Protestant groups in Europe, into acceptance of the Roman Pontifex Maximus, also known as the papacy, despite the Reformation. It was brought to America, for precisely the very same purposes politically. And it did accomplish what it was designed to do. But unfortunately, it also destroyed authentic historical Christianity, in the process. When it comes to Revelation 11, counter-reformationists know that verse 2 completely eliminates their time frame as even possible, because the text states that the two witnesses come 42 months after Jerusalem is given to the Gentiles. They know that puts the dating of things far into the past. They do know, but they do not care. They know in verse 4, John states the image he is describing of the two witnesses are symbolic. They do know that, but they do not care. They know in verses 2 and 9, John clearly states when the events occur, that he is describing as the two witnesses, Jerusalem is populated by Gentiles, not Jews. They know this is there, but they do not care that it is. They know the antiquated practice, described in verses 8 and 9, of public humiliation through corpse exposure, has passed away, and is no longer even legal, anymore. They know that, but they do not care. They know that the plagues and punishments described in verse 6, of the Black Death, Megadroughts and Red Tide, have already occurred in history. They do know they have happened. But they do not care. And they know that the earthquake described in verse 13, when Jerusalem was populated by Gentiles, and its population was still under 70,000, has already occurred. They know that too. But they simply do not care. They know all these things, and yet they simply do not care, because the purpose of counter-reformation theology has always been to hide the truth, not teach it to anyone. So, they intentionally hide these things from their audiences, and obfuscate these texts, whenever they teach on Revelation. Because, it's their job, to hide them. They are doing what they have been hired and paid to do. However, it is the job of anyone who truly loves and follows God, not to be deceived by them. And, to protect others among their families or friends, from those efforts to continually and willfully deceive the public. When we come to Revelation 11, verses 12 and 13, we reach the end of the age of the two witnesses, which will be marked by both signs in the heavens and signs in the earth, so that its conclusion is unmistakable. And also, so that, what is coming next, will also be just as unmistakable. There is no excuse for Bible and prophecy teachers who bear academic titles of doctor and professor and pastor, either to, not to know these facts which are clearly in the text, or admit them to their audiences and students. It is at a minimum professional negligence, but most likely, and in most cases, it comes down to simply, intentional deceit, Revelation chapter 11, verses 12 and 13 read as follows. And they heard a great voice from heaven, saying unto them, Come up hither. And they ascended up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies beheld them. And the same hour was there a great earthquake, and the 10th part of the city fell, and in the earthquake were slain of men 7,000, and the remnant were affrighted, and gave glory to the God of heaven. This is the last part of the second woe, and the 6th trumpet judgment, against the Antichrist. In this text we have both astronomical and geological events, marking its occurrence on the timeline of history. In verse 12, the text states that they heard a great voice from heaven. Some observations about the translation need to be made from the Greek text first. While there is generally nothing wrong with the translation in verse 11, there are some nuances in the original Greek which are lost in our English translation. And those nuances are sometimes very important. Unfortunately, there is no way to reflect them in our English translations. You saw that in the spelling of the words Apollo and Apollyon, using the addition of the famous Samian letter epsilon, in chapter 9. In Greek, the word for sound, and the word for voice, are the same word. We translate that word into our two different English words, sound, or voice, depending on how it is used in the sentence or paragraph. Picking one or the other, to translate the text. But in Greek, there was only one word. Sound and voice were the same Greek word, phone. It is the source of our English word, phone, as in telephone, and phonograph. Same Greek root. Phone. It is properly translated here into English as voice, because the text reports what the sound communicated to them. Thus the use of the English word voice. But that is not what is actually written in Greek. It is not a voice, but a phone, which means either one. Why is that important? Well, because if you are looking for only a voice, you might entirely miss what has actually been, very literalistically, prophesied. So what we are looking for is a phone, which is heard, and signifies or means ascension. And it is connected to the occurrence of the 6th trumpet judgment in our text. It may be a voice, or it may be a sound, or something that is both, in any case. But this nuance is lost in our English translation from the original Greek. So that is a very small, but important, detail to keep in mind. The second Greek nuance lost in translation we need to look at in this text is the translation of the word heaven. Today especially, when you say heaven in English, to most modern English-speaking audiences, they think of the place where people go after they die. They do not think of the sky. But in Greek, the word we translate as heaven is the Greek word, Uranos. And just like with the word phone, the Greek word, Uranos, is translated into two different English words, heaven, as in the place where people go, and the word sky, as in the thing we see when we go outside and look up. Two different words in English, both coming from a single Greek word, which means both. And just like with the translation of the Greek word, phone, this nuance in Greek language is completely lost when we translate it into English. But sky and heaven are the same word. So, while we read in English a voice is heard in heaven, what has been written in Greek is a sound is heard in the sky. But it also means what you read in English. But because of our multiple distinctive word sets in English of voice and sound, and heaven and sky, those linguistic nuances from the Greek manuscripts are simply lost, and remain hidden from the public, when they read this text. In English, there is quite a bit of difference from a sound in the sky, and a voice in heaven. But not in the original Greek. Both sentences, a voice in heaven, and a sound in the sky, are written exactly the same way in Greek. Precisely as we see here in this Greek text. The next observation that needs to be made about the text in verse 11, is that the text states after the sound or voice is heard in the sky or heaven signifying to ascend, they ascend in a cloud. While most people notice the ascension part, they rarely pay any attention to the little detail that the text says they are inside a cloud when it happens. So the only thing you would see from the outside, is a cloud. Not an ascension. The Greek word used there is epsilon nu, pronounced n, and means virtually the same thing as our English word, in, or in, as inside of. So we have a sequence of astronomical events, described as a sound heard in the sky, and an ascension inside of a cloud. This is a daytime event because clouds are not seen at night. They are black in the night sky, and the only indication they are there in the sky at night is the absence of light from normally visible stars. To actually see a cloud, it must be daylight. That is an inference from the text. So this is something that occurs during the daytime when it happens. The next observation we make concerning the text is that in verse 13, it says in the same hour when this sequence happens, there was a great earthquake. But it only damages 1/10 of the city, which is something of a contradiction. So that is a very odd earthquake. When you study the history of earthquakes in the Middle East, you will immediately realize that an earthquake that damages only 1/10 of a city is not great or large at all. In fact, here is a chart of earthquakes in the Middle East. The red bar at the end of that chart is the size described by this text. As you can see by comparison, such an earthquake would not be large at all. The only way the word great could be applicable to the term earthquake that only damages 1/10 of a city is that while it is seismically large, it does relatively little damage. And that would be a very odd earthquake. So John is describing an earthquake that is marked by its relatively large seismic activity, and yet its relatively small impact in terms of physical damage to the city of Jerusalem. And that would obviously in part explain why the Gentile residents of the city would be so amazed, and praising and thanking God after it was over. Which John also specifically describes in the text describing this earthquake. We will look specifically at the history of earthquakes in Jerusalem when we examine the fulfillment of this text in a few minutes. And as you will see, there is only one earthquake this description matches in history. And given John's descriptions, it could be no other. The next observation we need to make concerning this text is what appears to be John's description of fatalities which occurred during this earthquake. But there are some very odd expressions around the number 7,000 that he mentions. The text says or during the earthquake, 7,000 were slain of men, or killed. So what's the problem? The problem is John's use of the term, slain. When we read this text in English it sounds like John is simply describing the number of men killed by the earthquake. The only problem is that earthquakes do not slay men. They kill men, but they do not slay them. What's the difference? The difference is that the word translated as slain into English is the Greek word, apoktino. The Greek word, apoktino, is used 18 times in the New Testament and it is always used to refer to murder or execution. Not simply death, by accident or natural causes, but specifically murder or execution. It is the term used to describe the killing of a human, specifically by the hand of another human. It means execution or murder. It is the same term used of the execution of Christ in the crucifixion. Of these 18 uses of the Greek word, apoktino, in the New Testament, 9 times, or a full half of them occur in the book of Revelation. And once again, even in the book of Revelation, in every instance in which John uses the term, it is used to describe the killing of a human, at the hand of another human, meaning murder or execution, in every single instance. Without a single exception. But apoktino is not something an earthquake can even do. So this is either a mistake in John's grammar, or he is not describing fatalities as coming from the earthquake, which he is also clearly describing. John is saying there were 7,000 executions or murders during the earthquake, and his language in the Greek text. What on earth could this mean? You will see how amazing this prophecy actually literally was, in just a few minutes. So here are the prophetic events referred to in verses 12 and 13. 1. There is a sound or voice heard in the sky. 2. There is an ascension in a cloud, during the day. 3. During the hour of the ascension, an earthquake occurs in Jerusalem. 4. 7,000 murders or executions occurred during that time frame. 5. People are amazed by the earthquake and give glory to God. These are the specific descriptions of events we have in verses 12 and 13. When these events occur, the sixth trumpet and the second woe are pronounced completed, and past, in history. And now we will look at how they were literally fulfilled in history. In the previous video, you saw how the two witnesses were awakened and revived. and you saw how the astronomically dated time frame from the text identified precisely how this was fulfilled in real history, with something literally called the Great Awakening, down to the very day of the most significant event in its history. And now we only have 2 prophecies left on our checklist for Revelation 11 verses 1 through 14, which is the 6th trumpet and the 2nd woe. These 2 remaining prophecies are that a phone or voice is heard in the sky or heaven, the 2 witnesses ascend, and then there is an earthquake in Jerusalem, marking the end of the 6th trumpet. Our time frame, built on astronomical dating and time conversions taken from the text, put these events in the year 1834. That time frame, John creates for his prophecies in Revelation 11, verses 1 through 14, begins in the year 1390, and spans over 444 years of history, ending in the year 1834, with the description of an earthquake, specifically in the city of Jerusalem. If astronomical dating for these texts were simply fabricated out of thin air, or simply made up, it would be highly improbable that we would find any correlation to these precise and exact points in history that match the same descriptions found in these texts. While earthquakes are not uncommon in the Middle East, the odds that this exact year, along with this exact location, would correspond to exactly what happened would be incredibly small. Since the writing of Revelation in the 1st century, there have only been 14 earthquakes in Jerusalem in all of history. Only 14. The year we are currently in is the year 2020. The book of Revelation was written around the end of the 1st century. So that means there are 1,920 years available, and in these 1,920 years, only 14 quakes. That is on average, only 1 quake per every 137 years. The odds of hitting just a quake at all are 14 out of 1,920, or roughly 0.007. If you rounded the number to its nearest integer, it would actually be closer to 0 than to 1. So that is a very, very small probability. It's virtually 0. Yet, if you simply Google the main elements of the prophecy, Jerusalem, earthquake, and 1834, you will find an amazing, highly improbable thing. Not only is this highly improbable event real, you will see these amazing results. There will be 240,000 hits. The top of the page will describe an actual earthquake that literally happened in Jerusalem, exactly in the year 1834. You will also see something else quite amazing, that, as you will see, fulfills John's prophetic description. This earthquake occurred right smack dab in the middle of an historic battle known as the Siege of Jerusalem, or the Peasants' Revolt. But, as you will see, the details of the co-occurrence of these 2 events at precisely the same time in history fulfill John's prophecy in such amazing detail that it absolutely could not be the result of simple random coincidence. The chances of that are less than 0.007. They are quite literally next to nothing. And the earthquake of 1834 was the largest earthquake in terms of seismic activity in Jerusalem since the 1300s. Strangely enough, however, despite its great strength in terms of seismic activity, there was no documented loss of life, despite the fact that 7,000 people died. And you will find out more about that strange fact in a moment, and how this bizarre earthquake literally fulfilled John's prophecy. Now, however, let's look at the details of John's prophecy concerning this event, and see how they were actually and really fulfilled in very real history. Let's review our list of details from the text, and see how the events were fulfilled in the order of their description. When we look at the section of text in chapter 11 verses 12, 13 and 14, the first event from the list that we have described is that John says a voice, translated from the Greek word, phone, is heard from heaven or the sky. Phone being the Greek word translated as voice, which could be a voice, a sound, or a noise. John doesn't state explicitly if anyone hears the sound from the sky, beyond the 2 witnesses. But he makes a point of mentioning it. However, this is not the only time this expression or something similar to it occurs in Revelation. We haven't gone into detail yet about this phenomena, described in numerous texts throughout the book of Revelation. But here would be a good place to cover it, because it is associated primarily with the trumpet judgments. And because it is repeated in the seventh trumpet judgment in the next section's texts, which bring our timeline into the present day and the future, and which we will be looking at, that end the chapter, and the trumpet judgments. When John is describing things that occur in heaven, as you now know, the word heaven is the same word as sky, and in most cases he is actually describing astronomical phenomena in the sky, in order to date his prophecies. And the sounds he refers to, as being heard from or in heaven, are actually referring to, as being heard in or from the sky. He mentions specifically, hearing 3 different categories of sounds, that occur in the sky in the course of his visions. The first category, he simply describes as sounding like a voice. The second category, he describes as sounding like a trumpet. And the third category, he describes as sounding like thunder. He describes all 3 sounds as saying something relevant to his prophecies, which he reports in the individual texts. In total, there are 11 voice texts, 3 trumpet texts and 2 thunder texts in the book of Revelation, for a total of 16 texts referring to auditory phenomena as sounds in the sky. But what do they indicate? Voice phones indicate a prophetic message. Trumpet phones indicate conflict and war. And thunder phones indicate natural disasters such as earthquakes, volcanoes and floods. The occurrence of these sounds are prophesied by John as part of his astronomical signs in the sky, translated, heaven. The mention of these auditory, physical phenomena in the sky produces an objective point of reference for which interpretation is correct, between rapture theology's futurism, or in contrast, classical Protestant historicism, in eschatology. Because, if these things happen at the end of the world, in a 7-year tribulation period, then it would be logical not to expect these atmospheric phenomena to ever be heard in the sky, prior to then. Because that is the time frame futurism gives to it. But if the prophecy in Revelation truly is historical in nature, then we should expect to find some people throughout history to be hearing these auditory phenomena in the sky. And particularly so, in the time frames for which these events occur. So which is actually the case? Obviously it would be highly or extremely unlikely for people to hear 3 classes of specific, unusual, and apparently uncaused sounds, such as the sound of booms or trumpets, from the sky. So what actually happens when you simply Google the phrase, sound in the sky? If you do that, you are going to see the most unexpected and strange Google result you could possibly imagine. And this is the page it will produce. There are over 770 million results shown for this topic. Apparently, a lot of people have been reporting hearing unusual sounds in the sky. This is a screen capture of the Google page it produces. On the page you will see a row of links to 3 example videos, entitled Source Behind a Mystery Sound Heard Around the World, Strange Trumpet Sound in the Sky, Gothenburg, Sweden. If you look down the page, you will see these headlines. Strange Sound in the Sky 2019 Krapinski. Cause of strange trumpet sounds from sky a mystery. People hearing apocalyptic sounds coming from the sky all over the world. What's causing those weird trumpet noises in the sky? 5 sounds science can't explain. Etc. etc. On and on it goes. Google truncates its results after 21 full pages of links. And what is more strange about these sounds is that they cluster around 3 different forms of sound. The first is the trumpet sound, the second is a boom sound, and the third is described as a hum. The trumpet sound is obvious enough. The boom sound is like the thunder sound described by John. But what about the hum sound? The primary definition of the word hum, as given by Merriam-Webster's dictionary, is to utter a sound like that of speech prolonged. So on our modern current-day computer screens, we have the same 3 categories of sound being reported all over the world, as described in the prophecies in Revelation. The same 3 categories of sound in the sky. What are the odds of that? Atheists, skeptics and even NASA scientists have offered explanations, assuring the public it couldn't possibly have anything to do with Revelation. Why would they assert that so unconditionally, not even having any backgrounds in theology? How are they so sure? Because those are presuppositional claims. Those are claims based on philosophical presuppositions and personal ideological assumptions, not any evidence. In fact, Those claims are being made contrary to the actual evidence being documented and reported. They are so sure also, because they believe, based on those assumptions, the cause of the sounds can be explained, even if they currently have no explanation. The secular world leans heavily on the separation between natural and supernatural, created in Roman Catholic or Latin theology. The idea being that if something exists in nature, then it is not quote supernatural, and therefore it has nothing to do with God. And they think in contrast, if it doesn't exist in nature, then it must be supernatural, and therefore entirely spiritual, meaning belonging only to the non-material world. But the scriptures do not present the world divided into this dichotomy. There is no such natural-supernatural division in the scripture. It all belongs to God, and comes from Him. Everything from very weird quantum anomalies in physics that can't be rationally explained, to the daily routine rain cycle. It all belongs to the same category of reality, without separation. Just because we can explain something, doesn't mean it still doesn't also exist, in theological terms. We can explain how it rains, but that explanation doesn't mean God doesn't make it rain anymore. It just means you now understand how God does it. Explanations of possible causes do not erase their existence as spiritually significant. And the explanations themselves that they actually do provide are hardly conclusive or satisfactory to entirely dismiss this auditory phenomena as statistically unusual. The first explanation they pointed to was known hoax videos, and then they subsequently declared it all to be a hoax. This only lasted for a short time, because there were other instances that were known not to be hoaxes. And this is a poor argument from the beginning, in that there is known counterfeit money, but that doesn't erase the fact that there is also real money. The second explanation was that it was all mistaken and attributable to various other mistaken man-made sources such as train brakes, industrial construction, or sonic booms from jets. The problem with this claim was that researchers began to cite the same phenomena occurring in history, long before these things were even invented. Both NASA and the U.S. Geological Survey offered their speculations. The USGS explained it was really just geological gas and steam venting, caused by seismic activity. But then researchers offered documented examples of sounds occurring in areas and at times when there was no seismic activity present at all. Meteorological experts explained it was just something they called air ducting, carrying strange sounds from storms, from unusually far distances. But researchers noted these sounds often occurred when there were no faraway storms to generate the sounds. NASA offered the explanation that it was background noise from the Earth itself, and thus would naturally be heard all the time. The only problem, of course, is that it isn't heard all the time. It is rarely heard, and when it is heard, it is so shocking, people record it. So none of these explanations are logically consistent with what is being observed. And some skeptics' sites simply tried to mash them all together into a unified theory, claiming they are all caused by many different things, but never ever anything to do with revelation at all. Confident declarations, all made, despite their lack of even elementary study, in the book of Revelation or eschatology. It is obviously impossible to make sweeping declarations that one thing has nothing to do with another thing, if you have no familiarity at all with the thing you are making the claims about, as is continuously done. But regardless of whether there is ever a natural explanation for them, or not, the fact is, no one, not even the most ardent skeptic, can deny, regardless of the cause, they are in fact being heard, and they are being heard in the sky. And they are being heard in the sky, all over the world. We have no evidence these sounds were being heard specifically in Jerusalem in 1834, because the historical records for the events in 1834 are very limited. Egypt was in control of the area at the time, and most records of events would have been written in Arabic. There are basically only two descriptive historical sources cited on the internet for the earthquake and siege in 1834, and they were brief references written by a Greek Orthodox priest, and a few scholars on the subject of Islamic law in Palestine. And in the chaos of a war, details of this nature were hardly noticed. But there is an interesting historical correlation to these events. First, early historical documented reports of mystery sounds in the sky begin emerging from around the 1800s, as reported in this article. They have been around a very long time. Secondly, there is the mention that one of the earliest sources of these reports, in the Middle East, were made by Arab Bedouins. Why is this significant? Because the Bedouins were also one of the primary groups involved in the siege of Jerusalem in 1834. If you research the subject in general, you will discover these sounds are actually not new. But what is odd about these sounds, in connection to our prophecy in Revelation 11 verse 12, is that we have a prophecy about a sound being heard in the sky, around 1834. When you trace the documented origin of these sounds back in history, you will discover most reports of them begin in the middle to the late 1800s, right around the time frame given by John's prophecy. And some of the earliest documented reports in the 1800s were made by Arab Bedouins in the Middle East. And the Bedouins were directly involved in the revolt and siege of Jerusalem in 1834, the very one we will be looking at in a moment. While there is nothing in the text that says this is the sound that is heard in the sky, or even if the sound heard in the sky is heard by anyone other than the two witnesses, it is hard to miss this rather obvious connection. There is a prophecy about a sound being heard in the sky in the 1800s, and from the 1800s forward, we have documentation of strange sounds being heard in the sky. Even by the same people who were a part of the very events described in 1834, in Jerusalem. That's a pretty simple and straightforward correlation. Just as you saw previously, with emergence of red tide in history, or water turned to blood. Some people seem to think it matters what's causing these sounds, as though only the boo of a ghost would count as a manifestation of what was prophesied in Revelation. But there are no prophecies concerning their causes in physics. It prophesies only that the sounds are heard. Regardless of what is causing them, the fact they are being really physically heard, even into our own day, is the undeniable reality. And here is the most ironic thing about these auditory phenomena being heard in the sky. The people most likely to point to these trumpets heard in the sky as signaling the return of Christ are usually the very same people who believe in rapture counter-reformation theology. The problem is, rapture theology cannot account for these sounds in the sky throughout history and into our own day. In rapture theology, there is not supposed to be any trumpets in the sky until the rapture. And when you do hear a trumpet in the sky, the next thing that is supposed to happen after you hear that trumpet is that you are supposed to be suddenly flying through the air in a rapture. That's obviously not happening. So every time a real trumpet sound is actually heard in the sky, it is proof positive premillennialism's rapture theology is wrong. And God is giving you physical evidence of that fact. Otherwise you would be flying through the air immediately afterwards. Yet, it is obvious these sounds have been heard for centuries. So once more, that provides another example of very real phenomena from Revelation, like red tide, and global warming, and the sound of trumpets in the sky, which point exclusively to an historic interpretation of Revelation. None of which matches rapture theology and its exclusive tribulation period. But it certainly does match the historic interpretation absolutely perfectly. In fact, undeniably so. This auditory phenomena is John's prophesied phoné in the sky. Next we will look at the ascension of the two witnesses into the clouds in the sky. This building is one of the most famous and ancient buildings in Jerusalem. Prior to construction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, this building was used as an international symbol for the city of Jerusalem. As you see it used on the government-issued stamp from Equatorial Guinea. The first version of the building was constructed by wealthy Catholic religious pilgrims from Rome, between 384 to 390. Later in history, the Persian conqueror, Shah Khosrow II, destroyed the building during his conquest of Jerusalem. It was rebuilt in the 7th century by a religious pilgrim, a Frankish Catholic bishop, in the year 680 AD. The building was destroyed again during the Crusades, during the 12th century, and was rebuilt by the Crusaders. Shortly after their reconstruction, Jerusalem was conquered by the Muslims in the year 1187 AD, and the building was converted into a mosque and received its final architectural form with its current domed roof. The building is known today as the Chapel of the Ascension because it had been constructed where the religious pilgrims from the 4th century came to believe Christ had ascended to heaven. There is a pavement section enshrined in the building where it was believed footprints in the pavement marked the last spot on earth Christ stood before his ascension into heaven. And what does this ancient building have to do with the fulfillment of John's prophecy in Revelation chapter 11, verse 12? Well, that is what you are about to find out in just a few moments. The domed roof of the famous Chapel of the Ascension will become one of the central events of what happened in the earthquake of Jerusalem in the year 1834 AD. As you will soon see. When we look at verse 12, the next thing that happens after the phone in the sky is that the two witnesses ascend into heaven, or the sky. And within the hour, the earthquake in Jerusalem comes. So how did the two witnesses ascend into heaven in a cloud? And how did the earthquake occur within the same hour? As you saw in previous videos, John's reference to the two witnesses was symbolic, not literal. While John prophesied literal things, the reference itself John used to state the prophecy was often symbolically described. Many of these symbols are simply describing astronomical events John used to date his prophecies. As you have already seen, John's reference to the two witnesses were his reference to the constellation Gemini, also thought by Jews of symbolizing Enoch and Elijah, because they ascended to heaven, rather than the Greek association of Castor and Pollux. The time of year referred to as Gemini season is a month-long period from May 21st to June 21st. John has already given us the year 1834, and his time-frame material, taken from the 444 years given to the reader, from the measuring reed in verse 1. So now we have the year and the month of John's prophesied event. But, John is using astronomical dating to not only prophesy the precise year and month this earthquake would occur, but here, he is prophesying also the very hour it will occur. It will be in the daytime, in the very same hour, that Gemini ascends into the sky, directly overhead. If astronomical dating from these texts were simply all imagined or invented, then there would be very little chance that anything particularly relevant to his prophecy would be found during this very specific time frame. However, if John is in fact using astronomical dating to mark the occurrence of his prophecies in history, then we should expect to find the exact events given in his prophecy. An earthquake in Jerusalem at the very place, month, day, and hour of his astronomical reference. And the odds of that just randomly or accidentally occurring, exactly when he described, would be astronomically small. So, what really happened? Was this prophecy fulfilled? Let's take a look.
In 1834, Ibrahim Pasha, commander of the Egyptian army, came to Jerusalem to demand its Muslim citizens provide conscripts for his army. Conscription in those days in that part of the world was a virtual death sentence. The conscription lasted the person's entire lifetime. And if they were not killed outright in war, they would be destined to die of disease due to poor diet and terrible sanitary conditions, living in crowded and primitive military quarters. The residents of Jerusalem decided to fight against the Egyptian commander rather than surrender their children to a life of military slavery and eventual death under him. In the middle of their earliest fighting in Jerusalem, on May 13th, a sudden severe shock occurred, and although it was severe, it lasted only 3 seconds long and damaged few buildings. But the tremor was so shocking, it brought the fighting to a complete stop on both sides for the rest of the entire day. Recognizing as an act of God, both sides were in the fear of God and praising Him for sparing their lives. But this 3-second quake, which occurred on May 13th, would prove to be only a small birth pain of what was to come. Precisely 13 days later, after May 13th, On May 26, two major quakes occurred in a single day, and aftershocks from these quakes continued until midnight, damaging many houses, mosques, churches, and principal buildings in the city of Jerusalem. One of the principal buildings damaged was the famous Chapel of the Ascension, located on the Mount of Olives. The dome of this famous building had been completely collapsed. These two quakes are reported by historians to have begun in the early afternoon of May 26, 1834.
No specific time is ever cited by historical sources on the time of the May 26 double earthquake. But all historical sources do uniformly cite the double quakes on May 26, 1834, as beginning around early afternoon. So what time does early afternoon actually refer to? If you look up what early afternoon actually means in dictionary sources, such as Merriam-Webster's online dictionary, you will discover it refers to that part of the day between 1 to 3 o'clock. The midpoint of early afternoon is exactly 2 o'clock. So what was happening in the sky over Jerusalem that day, on May 26, 1834 between 1 and 3 o'clock, and specifically around approximately 2 o'clock? We will look at that now. We know that Gemini ascended into its pinnacle in the clouds directly over the city on May 26, at precisely 14:17 military time, or 2:17 p.m. that day, and literally, within the very hour, the main part of the earthquake of 1834 began. When we look at the list of prophetic statements created by chapter 11 verses 12 and 13, we discover that each element of the prophecy was fulfilled in this historic event. But what about John's reference to the 7,000 slain of men? How was this fulfilled? As you know, when John described the fatalities, he used the Greek word, apoktino, to describe the deaths. And as you recall, apoktino is a word that is used consistently throughout the New Testament to refer to death by the hand of another human, meaning murder or execution. Specifically, the earthquake of 1834 occurred right in the middle of an historic event, known as the Peasants' Revolt, and the Siege of Jerusalem. The two witnesses had ascended into the clouds. A tenth of the city of Jerusalem had been destroyed. And before the siege of Jerusalem was over, historians report, several thousands would be killed. But no specific number is usually offered. Instead they use the phrase several thousands. It is a phrase constantly repeated by historians describing the fatalities of this event. Several thousands. Well, that brings up the question, how many is several thousands? If you Google the definition of several, as in several thousand, you will discover the following: a couple means 2 or 3, a few means 3 to 6, and several means 7 or more. 7 or more is what several actually means. 7 or more, as in 7,000 slain. The exact number mentioned in verse 12. The siege of Jerusalem and the earthquake of 1834 was one of the deadliest historic events in the history of Israel. And it also marked the end of the testimony of the two witnesses, that Kronos should be no more. Protestant missionaries were rescued from the violence in Jerusalem by the U.S. Navy. Just 9 months later, counter-reformationist C.I. Scofield would be born in the United States. In 1883, after a stint in jail for financial fraud, he was ordained the pastor of First Congregational Church of Dallas, whose board of deacons were all Masons. His ministry of deceit would continue in the U.S. for decades, finally culminating in the rapture rewrite of the Bible known as the Scofield Reference Bible, published by Oxford Press in England, of the famous Oxford movement, and the founding of Dallas Theological Seminary, whose sole mission would be to spread this counter-reformation deception, along with the practice of Christmas, into every church pulpit in Christian America. 1834 truly did mark the end of the two witnesses in history. And thus, Revelation chapter 11 verses 12 and 13 were fulfilled with signs in the heavens and on earth, in the year 1834. And as Revelation 11 verse 14 states, the second woe is past. You have now seen how John's reference to the two witnesses were a reference to the constellation Gemini, used in order to date his prophecies, but also served as a symbolic prophetic reference to describe the future Protestant Reformation. And you have seen how 6 of the 7 trumpet judgments have unmistakably been fulfilled in real history, bringing us through chapter 11, literally verse by verse, from verse 1 all the way to verse 14. And you have seen how every prophetic time frame John created through astronomical dating was both amazingly detailed and accurate. And there is no other explanation for this detail and accuracy in his prophecies other than that astronomical dating is truly present in his texts. But that's not all when it comes to astronomical dating. As you will soon see in the next section of texts, beginning in verse 15 describing the 7th and final trumpet judgment, John will again make an overt reference to astronomical dating in his texts, this time claiming it to be evidence that God's rule over the world will be seen in the skies. You won't want to miss the exciting revelations awaiting you in the 7th trumpet judgment. Thank you for watching.